Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight, we begin not with music, not with fountains, not with silk cushions arranged in artistic disarray, but with a locked door. A very ordinary-looking door, in fact. Wood. Iron fittings. Guards who look like they have perfected the art of not reacting to anything. Behind that door was one of the most misunderstood institutions in world history, the Ottoman Imperial Harem. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy slow, thoughtful history that refuses to shout at you. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see how far these quiet conversations travel. Now, lower the lights a little. Maybe let the room cool. Because the harem was not built for spectacle. It was built for control. The word harem has suffered centuries of imaginative abuse. For many people, it immediately summons an image that looks suspiciously like a Renaissance painting that has never visited Istanbul and does not intend to. Silk cushions. Reclining women. Incense smoke. Idle luxury. Dramatic fainting for unclear reasons. The reality was far less theatrical and far more dangerous. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was not a pleasure palace. It was an administrative structure attached directly to the beating heart of imperial authority. It was hierarchy made domestic. It was politics conducted through proximity. If it helps, imagine a government ministry, but with fountains, strict etiquette, and consequences that could reshape the empire. Nothing inside the harem was casual. Not movement. Not conversation. Not silence. Silence, in fact, had rank. Everyone knew who outranked whom. Everyone knew who was favored, who was declining, who was being watched, and who was pretending not to notice any of it. And everyone understood that proximity to power was both privilege and exposure. The Ottoman Empire, at its height, stretched across 3 continents. Armies moved. Trade routes expanded. Diplomats negotiated. Wars were fought and concluded. But succession, the question of who would rule next, that was the empire's most dangerous vulnerability. And the harem existed, in part, to manage that vulnerability. It was not decorative. It was preventative. In earlier centuries of Ottoman rule, succession disputes had been brutal and direct. Brothers fought brothers. Survival meant eliminating rivals. The empire valued stability above sentiment. By the time the imperial household settled permanently in Topkapi Palace, the harem had become a controlled environment designed to regulate access to the sultan and, crucially, regulate the production and upbringing of potential heirs. This was not romance. This was risk management. Women did not simply wander into the harem because someone admired their appearance. Entry was structured and controlled. Some arrived as captives of war. Some were purchased through legal slave markets. Some were presented as diplomatic gifts. It is uncomfortable to say aloud. It was also entirely normal for the period. But here is where the popular fantasy collapses. Once inside, the story changed. The harem did not run on indulgence. It ran on sorting. New arrivals were evaluated immediately. Intelligence. Temperament. Adaptability. Memory. Discipline. These mattered far more than beauty. Beauty was common. Composure was rare. Most women would never meet the sultan. Many would never come close. They were assigned roles. They were trained. They were ranked. And ranking was everything. At the bottom were novices, young women in education, learning language, religion, etiquette, music, embroidery, calligraphy, and most importantly, restraint. Because ignorance was dangerous. And visible ambition was more dangerous still. The Ottoman court valued intelligence, but only when it was paired with control. Too clever, too outspoken, too noticeable, and praise turned into supervision. Supervision, in palace language, meant concern. Concern meant risk. The women who lasted were not necessarily the most dazzling. They were the most observant. They learned quickly that attention was currency. And like all currency, it fluctuated. A single glance from the Sultan could elevate someone's status overnight. But visibility came with pressure. Pressure led to mistakes. And mistakes were remembered with impressive dedication. The harem had no modern privacy. Conversations were overheard. Expressions were noted. Absences were observed. Memory was infrastructure. For those who rose, and only a few did, the stakes increased dramatically. To bear a son was to step into politics permanently. A prince was not merely a child. He was a potential future crisis. Every son represented a claim. Every claim represented tension. And tension, in Ottoman history, had not always ended peacefully. Motherhood elevated a woman's rank, but it also tied her fate to the unpredictable arc of succession. She gained resources, apartments, attendants. She also gained rivals. Other mothers. Other factions. Other ambitions wrapped in perfect courtesy. From that moment forward, her life became strategy disguised as maternal devotion. A prince had to appear capable but not threatening. Strong but not reckless. Loyal but not naive. His education was watched. His temperament was analyzed. And his mother stood at the center of it all, balancing pride with caution. Above them all stood one figure who did not compete. The Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. If the harem was a battlefield, she was its quiet general. Her authority inside the harem was absolute. She controlled rank, allowances, discipline, movement, and access. Officially, she did not govern the empire. Unofficially, her influence shaped decisions far beyond the palace walls. Grand viziers learned quickly that ignoring her opinion was ambitious. And short-lived. She ruled not through spectacle, but through routine. A delayed approval. A reassigned attendant. An invitation that did not arrive. By the time someone realized they had fallen from favor, the fall was already complete. The genius of the Ottoman Imperial Harem was not indulgence. It was containment. It turned potential chaos into structured hierarchy. It transformed ambition into ritual. It kept proximity to power tightly regulated. And for centuries, it worked. But systems built on control are only as strong as the people inside them. And people, even the disciplined ones, are not static. As the empire expanded, as sultans grew younger, as military pressures increased, the balance inside the harem shifted. Influence grew. Networks formed. Alliances emerged, quiet, flexible, deniable alliances. Servants carried messages. Eunuchs managed access. Favors were remembered. Grudges were archived. Nothing exploded dramatically. It shifted slowly. Like sand under careful feet. And over time, the women of the imperial harem were no longer merely participants in succession politics. They were shaping it. Historians would later call this period the Sultanate of Women. A dramatic name. But the reality, as always, was more administrative. Power moved through routine. Through influence. Through proximity. Through the simple ability to say yes or no at the right moment. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was never about fantasy. It was about survival inside a system where visibility was risk, memory was currency, and patience was often the only safe strategy. And that is only the beginning of our walk behind that ordinary wooden door. Because once we understand how the structure functioned, we can begin to examine how individuals navigated it. Not the exaggerated legends. Not the painted illusions. But the real calculations. The real silences. The real consequences. So settle in. Now let's move deeper inside. Not into a dramatic confrontation. Not into a forbidden romance. But into something much quieter. Routine. Because routine was the true architecture of the Ottoman Imperial Harem. Morning did not begin with languid stretching on embroidered cushions. It began with order. Attendants moved first. Doors opened in sequence. Water was carried. Floors were swept. Lamps extinguished. Schedules unfolded. Every movement inside the harem followed rank. Who walked first? Who waited? Who entered which courtyard? Who spoke? Who bowed? Who remained still? Hierarchy was not decorative. It was rehearsed daily until it became instinct. Young women in training rose early. They dressed plainly, hair arranged neatly, garments chosen not for display but for uniformity. They attended lessons in small groups, always supervised. Language came first. Ottoman Turkish, of course. Often Arabic. Sometimes Persian. Court life required comprehension more than conversation. To misunderstand an instruction was embarrassing. To misunderstand a political nuance was dangerous. After language came religion and protocol. Not in abstract philosophy, but in practical application. How to greet someone of higher rank. How to respond to a reprimand. How to kneel. How to withdraw from a room without turning your back improperly. There was a correct angle for everything. The harem was not chaotic because chaos threatened predictability. And predictability was stability. Stability kept the empire intact. Music lessons followed. Not for entertainment in the modern sense. Music revealed discipline. Breath control. Emotional restraint. Precision under observation. A trembling note could suggest nervousness. Nervousness suggested weakness. Weakness invited reassessment. Poetry was memorized. Not to perform dramatically, but to quote subtly. A well-placed line could flatter without appearing desperate. It could warn without accusing. It could express loyalty without exaggeration. Subtlety was survival. And always, there was observation. Older women watched the younger ones. Not cruelly. Not kindly. Simply attentively. Who adapted? Who resisted? Who complained? Who learned too quickly and seemed too eager? The most successful novices were those who appeared balanced. Neither invisible nor ambitious. Neither aloof nor overly friendly. They learned to calibrate themselves to the room. This calibration would matter later. Because advancement inside the harem was not random. It was gradual and deliberate. A woman might serve in the household of a higher-ranking consort. She might assist in organizing garments, overseeing inventories, coordinating attendance. Administrative competence was noticed. And remembered. The harem, despite popular imagination, was an enormous logistical system. Clothing inventories alone required careful management. Fabrics were recorded. Gifts catalogued. Allowances distributed. Rooms assigned according to status. Someone managed all of it. And that someone was rarely the sultan. It was women. Women who understood that power often looked like paperwork. Now, outside these walls, the empire functioned on visible authority. Military campaigns. Decrees. Taxation. Diplomatic missions. Inside the harem, authority functioned through access. Access to the sultan. Access to information. Access to influence. The black eunuchs, led by the chief eunuch, controlled the gates between the inner and outer palace. They were not decorative guards. They were institutional bridges. Messages passed through them. Requests were filtered by them. To maintain a good relationship with them was not optional. It was infrastructure. A delayed message could alter a future. A timely reminder could secure one. Women who understood this cultivated courtesy. Not flirtation. Not manipulation in the theatrical sense. Just steady, respectful rapport. Again, nothing dramatic. Everything strategic. Now let's talk about the Sultan himself. Contrary to popular fantasy, he did not wander the harem casually selecting companions at whim. Access was structured. Meetings were arranged carefully. Recommendations mattered. Timing mattered. And the Sultan was not free from pressure. He was watched. His choices signaled preference. Preference signaled potential succession. Succession triggered calculations. If he favored one woman too openly, factions formed around her. If he distributed attention evenly, he risked appearing indecisive. If he withdrew entirely, uncertainty spread. The harem was not only evaluating him. He was navigating it as well. And then, occasionally, a woman emerged who understood this environment not just as a participant, but as a strategist. Hurrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxolana, is perhaps the most famous example. She did not rise because she was merely favored. She rose because she adapted. Unlike earlier concubines who bore a son and were sent to provincial governorships with him, Hurrem remained in Istanbul. She married the Sultan, an unprecedented act that disrupted established patterns. But even this was not reckless rebellion. It was gradual transformation. She built charitable foundations. Corresponded diplomatically. Embedded herself not only in domestic hierarchy but in imperial identity. Her influence was not loud. It was sustained. And that is what frightened observers. European ambassadors wrote letters filled with fascination and alarm. They described seduction. Sorcery. Feminine manipulation. It was easier to imagine enchantment than administration. But the truth was more mundane and more powerful. She understood proximity. She understood memory. She understood that controlling narrative was as important as controlling access. And this pattern would repeat. Women did not overthrow the system. They mastered it. Now consider the emotional environment of such a place. Not melodrama. Not constant paranoia. But vigilance. Imagine living in a space where every gesture might be interpreted politically. Where friendships were sincere but conditional. Where alliances shifted slowly, rarely announced. You would learn to measure yourself carefully. You would celebrate quietly. You would grieve carefully. Because even grief had optics. If a prince fell ill, concern was expected. But hysteria suggested instability. If he recovered, gratitude must not appear boastful. Every emotional display required moderation. This culture of restraint shaped generations. It produced women who could negotiate endowments, oversee construction projects, manage households of hundreds, and influence imperial appointments, all while maintaining an exterior of composed obedience. And yet, despite this control, instability never vanished entirely. Because the greatest uncertainty lay not in etiquette, but in succession. Ottoman tradition permitted multiple sons. It did not establish strict primogeniture. In earlier centuries, upon a sultan's death, sons competed, sometimes violently, for the throne. Later reforms would confine princes within the palace, a system known as the kafes, or cage, limiting their experience and movement to prevent rebellion. Protection. And isolation. A prince raised in confinement grew into a ruler shaped by caution, sometimes by fear. And the mothers of these princes watched, waited, and calculated. Their influence peaked when their son ascended. Until then, they endured. Now pause for a moment. Consider the paradox. The harem was built to prevent chaos. To regulate access. To manage succession. To contain ambition. And for long stretches of history, it succeeded. The empire endured for centuries. But over time, scale complicates control. As military defeats mounted in later centuries, as economic pressures grew, as European powers encroached, internal politics intensified. And the harem, always near the center of succession, became an even more sensitive space. Not because it was decadent, but because it was decisive. When a young sultan ascended, inexperienced and surrounded by advisors, his mother's influence expanded. When a strong sultan ruled confidently, the inner palace receded slightly into structured routine. The rhythm of the empire echoed inside these walls. Expansion. Stability. Strain. Adjustment. And always, behind carved screens and tiled courtyards, women who had been trained from adolescence to remain calm under pressure continued doing exactly that. Managing. Observing. Remembering. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was not a fairy tale. It was a pressure chamber. It shaped individuals who would never appear on battlefields yet whose decisions influenced generals. It produced charitable foundations that still stand. It stabilized transitions that might otherwise have fractured the empire. And it did so through discipline. Through memory. Through patience. So when we speak of secrets, we should not imagine whispered romances in candlelight. We should imagine ledgers. We should imagine carefully timed introductions. We should imagine a mother advising her son in measured tones, aware that every word might echo for decades. The real secret of the Ottoman Imperial Harem is this. It was never about indulgence. It was about endurance. And endurance, unlike spectacle, rarely paints itself dramatically. It simply persists. And we are still only halfway down the corridor. And as the lamps burned lower in the corridors of the imperial palace, the world outside barely understood what the word harem truly meant. To many European visitors writing from afar, it was a fantasy. A forbidden paradise. A place of silk cushions and endless leisure. But inside the walls of the great palace in Istanbul, within the vast complex of Topkapi Palace, the imperial harem functioned less like a dream and more like a carefully structured institution. It was a political organism. It had hierarchy, schedules, discipline, education, and above all, silence. The young girls who entered were rarely born into privilege. Many arrived from distant provinces of the empire, from the Balkans, the Caucasus, the Black Sea regions. Some came through tribute systems. Others through palace networks that sought intelligence and beauty in equal measure. When they arrived, their old names were often set aside. They were given new names. New identities. New futures. But not immediately. First, they entered the lowest rank. They learned the language of the court, Ottoman Turkish. They learned embroidery. Music. Poetry. Court etiquette. Religion. The precise way to walk across a tiled floor without making sound. The proper depth of a bow. The exact phrasing required when addressing a superior. Nothing in the harem was accidental. Even stillness was trained. The hierarchy was strict. At the bottom were the novices. Above them, trained attendants. Above them, favored women. And at the top, towering above them all, stood the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. Her authority was extraordinary. During certain periods, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, historians would later refer to this era as the Sultanate of Women. It was not an official title. But it reflected reality. Women like Hurrem Sultan changed the structure of power forever. Hurrem did something unprecedented. She married the Sultan. Before her, Ottoman rulers did not formally marry their concubines. They avoided marriage to prevent powerful in-law families from interfering in politics. But Hurrem, the favored companion of Suleiman the Magnificent, altered the tradition. She bore multiple sons. She secured legal recognition. And through correspondence, patronage, and diplomacy, she influenced imperial policy. She funded architectural projects. She wrote letters to foreign rulers. She shifted the center of political gravity inward, into the palace. And once that door opened, it never fully closed. After her came powerful Valide sultans who governed not from the throne, but from behind lattice screens. When a sultan ascended young, sometimes as a child, his mother effectively ruled. She controlled access. She approved appointments. She listened behind curtains. She shaped outcomes. The harem was therefore not a distraction from governance. It was governance. Yet life inside it was not peaceful. For every favored woman, there were dozens who remained in waiting. Competition was quiet but constant. A single glance from the sultan could change everything. To bear a son was security. To bear a daughter was respectable. To bear nothing was dangerous. Because succession in the Ottoman system was brutal in its efficiency. There was no clear primogeniture. Any son of the sultan could become ruler. And when a new sultan ascended, his brothers posed a threat. The solution, at least in earlier centuries, was stark. Fratricide. It was legalized under Mehmed II to prevent civil war. Better one controlled execution than decades of conflict. So the nursery of the harem was not simply a place of lullabies. It was a waiting room of fate. Mothers knew this. They understood that their sons were both precious and vulnerable. And so alliances formed. Subtle, careful alliances. With eunuchs. With tutors. With viziers. The chief black eunuch, who guarded the inner palace, became one of the most powerful figures in the empire. He controlled communication between the harem and the outside world. He could open doors. Or close them. His loyalty was everything. And loyalty in the Ottoman court was never assumed. It was cultivated. Rewarded. Tested. Meanwhile, beyond the harem walls, the empire stretched across 3 continents, from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from North Africa to the Caucasus. Campaigns were launched. Treaties signed. Rebellions suppressed. And inside the palace, behind screens of carved wood and tiled walls of blue Iznik patterns, the women of the harem followed every development. Because war affected succession. Succession affected survival. When a sultan left for campaign, tension inside the palace rose. Would he return victorious? Would he return at all? If he died without clear designation, chaos could erupt. And chaos did not spare the women. Some were married off to officials. Some retired into quieter palace sections. Some faded from record entirely. Yet others rose. In the 17th century, figures like Kozum Sultan wielded immense authority. Kozum served as regent for her sons and even her grandson. She navigated court factions. Managed stipends. Influenced appointments. Her political skill was undeniable. But so was the danger surrounding her. Power inside the palace was intimate. It was not decided in public squares. It was decided in whispered rooms. And whispers could turn sharp. As decades passed, the structure of succession changed. Fratricide became less common. Instead, potential heirs were confined in a section known as the kafes, the cage. Not a literal iron cage, but a secluded palace apartment where princes lived in isolation until called to rule. This solved one problem and created another. Some princes emerged inexperienced. Unprepared. Shaped by confinement rather than governance. Which meant the influence of their mothers, tutors, and palace networks became even more significant. The harem adapted. It always adapted. It was not frozen in time. It evolved with the empire. Architecturally, it expanded. New courtyards were built. New tiled chambers. Private baths. Prayer rooms. The design ensured separation and surveillance at the same time. Privacy was controlled. Access was layered. Movement required permission. Even the sound of footsteps carried meaning. At night, the palace quieted. Oil lamps flickered against painted ceilings. Some women embroidered. Some read. Some prayed. Some planned. Because tomorrow might bring promotion. Or removal. Or nothing at all. And in the Ottoman court, nothing at all was sometimes the most frightening possibility. And so the rhythm of the imperial harem continued, not in bursts of drama, but in slow, measured repetitions that marked the passing of years. Morning began before sunrise. The call to prayer echoed faintly across Istanbul, drifting over the domes and minarets, reaching even the inner courtyards of Topkapi Palace. Within the harem, lamps were extinguished one by one. Attendants rose quietly. Water was poured into copper basins. White linen garments were unfolded. There was no rushing. Everything in the palace moved with deliberate restraint. After prayer came instruction. Younger girls gathered in supervised rooms lined with cushions and low wooden desks. An older attendant or appointed tutor would guide them through reading and recitation. Ottoman Turkish was essential, but so was Persian poetry, Quranic study, and courtly expression. Education in the harem was not ornamental. It was strategic. A woman who could compose elegant letters held power. A woman who understood diplomacy, even indirectly, could influence outcomes. Some women learned music, the oud, the canon. Others perfected calligraphy or gold thread embroidery. These were not idle accomplishments. They were visible signs of refinement, markers that could attract favor or elevate status. Meals were structured and regulated. Food arrived from the palace kitchens in carefully organized trays. Rice dishes, stewed vegetables, lamb prepared with subtle spices. Sweet sherbets in the afternoon. Coffee, increasingly popular from the 16th century onward, became part of social ritual. Coffee gatherings were quiet centers of conversation. Not loud. Not reckless. Measured. Information passed in fragments. A change in the Grand Vizier. A letter received from a provincial governor. Rumors of military movement along the frontier. Though physically enclosed, the harem was not isolated from the empire. News entered through eunuchs, through official announcements, through controlled channels of communication. The chief black eunuch remained pivotal. He was the guardian of gates and secrets. His position placed him between two worlds, the male political sphere of the imperial council and the female political sphere of the harem. His loyalties mattered immensely. Over time, the influence of this office grew so significant that foreign ambassadors recognized it as a critical node of power. Meanwhile, festivals broke the monotony. When a prince was born, the palace transformed. Cannons boomed from the shoreline. Lanterns illuminated courtyards. Silk garments were distributed. Gold coins scattered among attendants. The mother of the newborn prince received increased status immediately. Her apartments might be enlarged. Her stipend increased. Her future secured, at least temporarily. Yet celebration always carried tension. Because each prince born was both blessing and competition. In earlier centuries, when fratricide was still practiced, mothers understood that only one son could ultimately survive the struggle for the throne. Later, when confinement replaced execution, rivalry did not disappear, it simply changed form. The cafe system created princes who waited in uncertainty. Some spent decades in semi-isolation. Their mother's influence during those years could shape alliances that later determined their effectiveness as rulers. By the 17th century, during what historians call the period of heightened female influence, the Valide Sultan's apartments were among the most politically active spaces in the empire. Consider the career of Kozum Sultan. She navigated multiple reigns. She survived factional struggles. She acted as regent when her sons were too young to rule independently. Her decisions shaped appointments at the highest levels. But power inside the palace was delicate. Rivalries among court factions eventually contributed to her downfall. Even within the harem, alliances could fracture. Loyalty shifted when survival demanded it. Another towering figure emerged later, Turhan Sultan. She too served as regent. She supported major architectural projects and influenced state policy. During her time, the empire faced both internal revolts and external military pressures. The palace became a stabilizing core during turbulence. Outside the harem walls, the empire encountered challenges, wars with the Habsburgs, shifting trade routes, rising European naval powers. But within the palace, the rhythm remained steady: instruction, ceremony, childbirth, mourning, promotion, retirement. The architecture itself reinforced hierarchy. The further inward one traveled, the more restricted the access became. Carved wooden screens allowed observation without exposure. Iznik tiles shimmered in blue and white, reflecting light from small windows placed high along the walls. Courtyards provided controlled access to sunlight and air. Bathhouses within the harem were not merely for cleanliness. They were social environments where bonds formed. Ritual bathing marked transitions, before marriage, after childbirth, during festivals. The sound of water echoed gently against marble surfaces. In quieter hours, older women told stories. Not necessarily stories of romance. Stories of strategy. Of patience. Of mistakes made decades earlier. The harem had memory. It preserved lessons in subtle ways. As the 18th century unfolded, the Ottoman Empire began engaging more directly with European diplomatic culture. Ambassadors described the palace in detail. Curiosity in Europe intensified. Paintings and travelogues exaggerated what they could not see. The myth of the harem grew larger than its reality. Yet inside, daily life remained disciplined and structured. Some women eventually left the palace through arranged marriages to high-ranking officials. This was not exile. It was a strategic placement. Former palace women often brought refined education and political awareness into their new households. They became cultural transmitters of palace norms. Others remained in the palace for life. Aging within the harem meant gradual withdrawal from active competition. Influence did not vanish, but it shifted toward mentorship and advisory roles. As centuries passed, reforms began reshaping the empire. By the 19th century, under sultans such as Mahmud II, modernization efforts altered military and administrative structures. Western-style reforms affected architecture, clothing, and protocol. Later, during the reign of Abdulmajid I, the Tanzimat reforms introduced sweeping bureaucratic changes intended to reorganize the empire along more centralized and codified lines. These transformations did not immediately dismantle the harem. But they subtly shifted its role. The imperial court moved from Topkapi Palace to the more European-influenced Dolmabahce Palace along the Bosphorus. The architecture changed: grand staircases, crystal chandeliers, larger windows. The old inward labyrinth gave way to more open ceremonial spaces. Yet even in new settings, the core structure of the imperial household persisted: hierarchy, discipline, education, and the powerful presence of the Valide Sultan. Gradually, as the empire entered its final century, the political weight of the harem diminished compared to earlier eras. Constitutional movements, parliamentary experiments, and growing European pressure shifted decision-making into new arenas. Still, the memory of centuries remained embedded in its walls. When the Ottoman Empire ended after the First World War and the Republic of Turkey was established, the palace complex became a museum. Visitors now walk through rooms once guarded by layers of protocol. They see tiled walls, low couches, intricate latticework. They imagine stories. Some imagine romance. Some imagine cruelty. But the reality was more complex, and quieter. The harem was not a single emotion. It was an institution shaped by law, religion, politics, survival, and adaptation. It was a place where women could be powerless, and yet at times extraordinarily powerful. Where silence was both imposed and chosen. Where ambition moved not through public speeches, but through patience. And as night settled again over Istanbul, and the Bosphorus reflected moonlight, the old palace stood in layered stillness, a structure that once contained laughter, fear, ceremony, strategy, birth, mourning, and long stretches of waiting. Waiting was perhaps the most consistent experience of all. Waiting for promotion. Waiting for favor. Waiting for a sun to ascend. Waiting for news from the battlefield. Waiting for change. And in that waiting, history unfolded quietly, one measured breath at a time. And so, beyond the public ceremonies and the structured routines, there existed the private interior world of emotion, carefully controlled, rarely recorded, but deeply felt. A young woman entering the imperial harem did not arrive with knowledge of her future. She arrived with uncertainty. The early months were often the most disorienting. The language was unfamiliar. The expectations were strict. The older attendants observed closely, posture, obedience, grace, intelligence. Talent could elevate a girl quickly, but arrogance could stall her progress just as fast. Patience was the most valuable skill. The harem rewarded patience more than beauty. Because beauty could attract attention, but patience sustained survival. In the afternoons, after formal instruction and assigned duties, there were quieter hours. Some women practiced music in low tones so as not to disturb higher-ranking residents. Others embroidered ceremonial garments that would eventually be worn by the sultan during festivals or by a prince during a public procession. Embroidery was not merely decorative. Patterns carried meaning, tulips symbolizing abundance, carnations representing loyalty, cypress trees signifying endurance. These motifs appeared repeatedly in textiles, tiles, and illuminated manuscripts throughout the Ottoman court. The visual language of the empire was everywhere inside the harem. Sometimes, an announcement would ripple through the corridors: the sultan would visit the inner palace that evening. Preparation began immediately. Baths were drawn. Hair was perfumed with rosewater. Garments of silk were selected according to rank. Jewelry was modest but deliberate, nothing ostentatious without permission. Contrary to later fantasy, there was no chaotic competition. Protocol determined access. The sultan did not wander unpredictably. Schedules were structured, even if not publicly disclosed. If a woman was chosen for companionship, her status shifted. If she bore a child, especially a son, her position stabilized significantly. Motherhood within the harem created a parallel hierarchy. The mother of a prince gained private apartments, attendants, and an increased stipend. She became responsible not only for nurturing but for education. Tutors were assigned, but the mother remained a shaping presence. Princes began instruction at a young age: languages, theology, calligraphy, military theory. In earlier centuries, they were sent to provincial governorships as teenagers to gain administrative experience. Their mothers sometimes accompanied them, forming miniature courts in distant cities. This practice connected the harem to the broader empire directly. A mother guiding her son in a provincial capital might quietly cultivate alliances with local officials, strengthening his future claim to the throne. But when succession practices changed and princes were kept within palace confinement, this provincial experience diminished. The psychological landscape of the caliphs altered the development of future rulers. Isolation could produce caution. It could also produce fragility. In such circumstances, the guidance of the Valide Sultan became even more critical. One of the earliest and most transformative figures of the imperial harem, Hurrem Sultan, demonstrated how influence could extend beyond palace walls. Through charitable foundations, mosques, hospitals, soup kitchens, she embedded her legacy within the physical cityscape of Istanbul. These public works were not vanity projects. They were instruments of legitimacy. Later Valide sultans followed similar patterns, commissioning architectural complexes that reinforced both piety and authority. Patronage allowed women of the harem to step symbolically into public space without ever appearing unveiled before the masses. The empire recognized this balance. Visibility through architecture. Invisibility in person. Meanwhile, daily discipline continued. Infractions of protocol carried consequences. Gossip could lead to demotion. Unauthorized communication with the outer palace was forbidden. The harem was enclosed not only by walls but by rules. Yet within these boundaries, friendships formed. Shared childhoods created quiet sisterhoods. Women who entered together sometimes remained allies for decades. These relationships could outlast romantic favor. Festivals provided rare moments of shared celebration. During religious holidays, trays of sweets circulated. Musicians performed softly. Lanterns illuminated tiled corridors. Even then, hierarchy remained intact, but laughter was permitted. Over time, the Ottoman court became increasingly aware of European scrutiny. Travelers wrote elaborate, often exaggerated accounts of harem life. Paintings imagined reclining figures in idle luxury. The reality was less theatrical. It was administrative. Structured. Often repetitive. The 18th century brought gradual cultural shifts. European fashions influenced certain aspects of court attire. Diplomatic gifts included clocks, fabrics, porcelain. The palace adapted selectively. Yet the core institution endured. When the court eventually moved residence to Dolmabahce Palace in the 19th century, architectural style changed dramatically: crystal chandeliers, grand staircases, larger ceremonial halls influenced by European design. But even there, separation between public and private remained. The imperial family still maintained internal hierarchy. The Valide Sultan still held precedence among women. Protocol still governed movement. Under Abdul Hamid II, political centralization intensified. Suspicion of dissent grew. Surveillance extended beyond the palace into the empire itself. In such an atmosphere, the inner court remained both refuge and observation chamber. By then, however, the world was changing rapidly. Telegraphs transmitted news quickly. Railways connected distant provinces. Newspapers circulated public opinion. The quiet, insulated influence once exercised within carved wooden screens could no longer shape events as completely as before. And yet, even in its final decades, the harem preserved ceremony. Births were recorded meticulously. Marriages arranged carefully. Education maintained. When the Ottoman dynasty was eventually dissolved in the early 20th century, members of the imperial family left the palace, some into exile, some into obscurity. The vast institution that had functioned for centuries dissolved quietly. Today, visitors walking through Topkapi Palace see silent rooms. They observe Iznik tiles shimmering in filtered light. They pause in narrow corridors and imagine echoes of footsteps long faded. But what remains most striking is not excess. It is order. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was an institution shaped by discipline, hierarchy, adaptation, and the steady negotiation of power behind screens. It was neither paradise nor prison alone. It was a system. A system that mirrored the empire itself, layered, ceremonial, resilient, and ultimately subject to time. And in the quiet continuation of palace life, attention often turned to details so small that they rarely appear in grand histories. The way a sash was tied. The order in which cushions were arranged. The exact distance one stood from a superior. These details were not trivial. They were signals. In a world where speech was measured, posture and fabric carried meaning. Clothing within the imperial harem followed hierarchy as strictly as titles did. Fine silks and velvets were reserved for higher ranks. Certain colors were favored at specific times. Layers of gauze, long-sleeved antares, embroidered kaftans lined with fur in winter, all chosen carefully. Jewelry, too, was regulated. Pearls, emeralds, and rubies appeared during formal occasions, but excess without authorization could be interpreted as ambition displayed too boldly. The Valide Sultan's garments were especially symbolic. Her attire reflected not only wealth but maternal sovereignty. She did not simply dress as a woman of rank. She dressed as the symbolic mother of the dynasty. In earlier centuries, during the reign of figures such as Suleiman the Magnificent, court fashion influenced the broader elite across the empire. Styles adopted in the palace often spread outward to provincial governors' households. This cultural influence was subtle power. The palace dictated taste. And taste carried legitimacy. Beyond clothing, the palace economy itself was vast. The harem required textiles, perfumes, food, paper, candles, ceramics, medicines. Entire supply chains connected artisans in Anatolia and beyond to the inner court. Iznik tilemakers, silk weavers from Bursa, jewelers from the capital, all indirectly linked to the daily rhythm of the harem. The imperial treasury allocated specific stipends to women according to rank. These stipends were recorded meticulously. Financial documentation reveals how structured the system truly was. Even generosity followed protocol. When a sultan's daughter married, the ceremony was elaborate and political. Princesses were married to high-ranking statesmen, grand viziers, admirals, military commanders. These marriages bound powerful men to the dynasty more tightly. The wedding processions were public spectacles. Carriages draped in fabric. Musicians lining the streets of Istanbul. Fireworks illuminating the skyline. Yet the bride herself had been shaped entirely within palace walls, educated, disciplined, accustomed to hierarchy. Marriage did not free her from politics. It expanded her sphere. Some princesses maintained influence over their husbands' careers. Their palace upbringing gave them insight into court expectations that few outsiders possessed. Meanwhile, inside the harem, the education of young girls continued in cycles. New arrivals replaced those who married out. Elder attendants aged into advisory roles. Memory accumulated. Stories of past reigns were told softly, about the ambition of Hurrem Sultan, about the regency of Kozum Sultan, about the careful navigation of palace intrigue by successive Valide sultans. These narratives were lessons. They were cautionary tales. They were reminders that influence required restraint. The 18th century introduced new cultural elements. European clocks chimed within palace rooms. Porcelain from distant lands appeared on trays. Musical tastes broadened. But the architecture of separation remained. High walls. Guarded gates. Layered courtyards. Privacy was engineered. And yet, the women of the harem were not unaware of the broader world. They received news of wars, reforms, revolts. When the empire faced setbacks, territorial losses, financial strain, anxiety rippled inward. Because instability outside the palace always affected stability inside it. The 19th century brought accelerating change. Under rulers such as Mahmud II and later Abdülmecid I, reforms attempted to modernize military and administrative structures. Western dress codes were introduced for male officials. Bureaucratic ministries expanded. The palace could not remain untouched. The move from Topkapi Palace to Dolmabahce Palace symbolized this transformation. Dolmabahce faced the Bosphorus openly. Its architecture embraced European symmetry and ornamentation. Yet within it, the imperial household retained internal boundaries. The harem adapted once more. Rooms became larger. Windows admitted more light. European furniture appeared beside traditional divans. Pianos joined ouds in certain chambers. But hierarchy endured. The Valide Sultan still presided. Consorts still followed rank. Princes still received careful education. By the late 19th century, during the reign of Abdülhamid II, the empire's political climate grew increasingly tense. Constitutional experiments, suspensions, surveillance networks, all unfolded beyond palace walls. Inside, caution deepened. Access tightened. Communication became even more controlled. Yet even in those final decades, daily life retained its rhythm. Morning prayers. Lessons. Embroidery. Music practiced softly. Birth announcements. Measured ceremonies. The continuity itself became a form of stability. And then, in the early 20th century, the continuity ended. War engulfed the empire. Defeat reshaped borders. The Ottoman dynasty was abolished. Members of the imperial family departed into exile, some carrying only fragments of the world they had known. The vast institutional memory of the harem dissolved almost overnight. Rooms once guarded by eunuchs opened to officials cataloging artifacts. Silks were folded into museum cases. Documents archived. Tiles preserved. Today, visitors walk through those same corridors in Topkapi Palace, their footsteps echoing softly. They peer into chambers where mothers once calculated their sons' futures. They observe the lattice screens that once concealed watchful eyes. It feels distant. Almost unreal. But for nearly 4 centuries, the imperial harem functioned as one of the most consistent institutions in the Ottoman state. It educated. It disciplined. It preserved lineage. It influenced governance. It adapted to reform. It endured until endurance itself was no longer possible. And as evening once again settles over Istanbul, the Bosphorus reflecting quiet light between continents, the palace stands as a reminder that power does not always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it teaches. Sometimes it weaves silk threads into political webs so fine they are nearly invisible. The story of the Ottoman Imperial Harem is not a single dramatic tale. It is a long, measured unfolding. A rhythm repeated across generations. A world behind walls that shaped an empire stretching across 3 continents. And even now, in stillness, its echoes remain. And after the empire itself dissolved, the silence inside the former imperial residences felt different. Not the disciplined silence of protocol. Not the watchful silence of hierarchy. But the hollow quiet of absence. When the Ottoman dynasty was formally abolished in 1924 under the new Republic of Turkey, members of the imperial family were required to leave the country. Some departed from the docks of Istanbul carrying only small trunks. Others left quietly by train. Princes, princesses, widowed consorts, elderly attendants, individuals who had spent their entire lives within layered palace walls suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar European cities. For women who had been raised in the imperial harem, the transition was especially stark. They had grown up within strict schedules. They had rarely moved through public streets unescorted. They had lived inside a carefully structured hierarchy that defined every interaction. Exile removed that structure overnight. Some adapted with resilience. A few former princesses married into European aristocratic families. Others lived modestly, relying on limited financial support or the assistance of relatives. The habits of discipline remained: early rising, precise manners, careful speech, even when the surroundings no longer reflected imperial grandeur. The old harem system, however, did not survive in exile. Without a reigning sultan, there was no valide sultan. Without succession, there was no hierarchy of consorts. The institution that had shaped generations simply ceased to function. Back in Istanbul, the palaces were gradually transformed into museums. Topkapi Palace, once the heart of imperial administration and domestic life, became a historical monument. Visitors began walking through the harem apartments, observing tiled rooms and enclosed courtyards that had once been inaccessible to nearly everyone. Glass cases replaced guarded thresholds. Labels replaced whispers. What had been an active political environment became a preserved artifact. And yet, the architecture still communicates something. The narrowing corridors. The layered gates. The sequence of increasingly private chambers. They reveal how carefully space was used to organize authority. Even the smallest room carries evidence of routine, fireplaces built low, niches carved for lamps, alcoves for storage. If one imagines the 16th century, during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, these corridors would have been filled with measured footsteps and muted conversation. If one imagines the 17th century, during the regencies of figures like Kozum Sultan or Turhan Sultan, one might picture messengers arriving discreetly, decisions forming behind screens. But today, the silence is different. It is reflective. Visitors often arrive carrying the inherited myths of the harem, images shaped by novels, paintings, and dramatic retellings. They expect extravagance or scandal. Instead, they encounter organization, structure, repetition. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was less a fantasy and more a disciplined domestic bureaucracy intertwined with dynastic survival. It was a school, a residence, a political observatory, a system designed to preserve continuity. The women within it navigated constraints with intelligence. They operated within limits, yet sometimes expanded those limits through careful strategy. They understood timing, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to build alliances, when to withdraw. Their power rarely appeared in official chronicles written by male bureaucrats. But archival documents, stipends, architectural endowments, charitable foundations, reveal their impact. Consider again the long arc of transformation. From the early consolidation of the harem at Topkapi Palace, through the dramatic influence of Hurrem Sultan, through the era often described as the Sultanate of Women, through 18th century cultural shifts, through 19th century reforms under rulers like Mahmud II and Abdulmajid I, through the guarded centralization of Abdul Hamid II, and finally, through abolition and exile. At each stage, the harem adapted. It expanded physically. It restructured succession practices. It absorbed foreign influences. It responded to political instability. Yet its core remained surprisingly consistent: hierarchy, education, maternal influence, and controlled access to the sovereign. Perhaps the most enduring feature was not luxury. It was patience. Generations of women learned to wait, for favor, for childbirth, for news from the frontiers, for the shifting of rank. Waiting became an art form. And within that waiting, subtle forms of agency emerged. History often focuses on battles and treaties. But empires also depend on households, on lineage, on upbringing, on the quiet shaping of heirs long before they step into public view. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was precisely that shaping ground. A private world that influenced a public empire. Now, as evening settles once again over the skyline of Istanbul, and ferries cross the Bosphorus between Europe and Asia, the old palace stands layered with centuries of memory. The tiles still reflect light. The courtyards still hold air. The walls still enclose space once filled with strategy and ceremony. And the story continues, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like the turning of pages in a long chronicle. There is still more to unfold: deeper exploration of daily hour-by-hour routines, the psychology of confinement in the caves, the lives of lesser-known consorts, the role of art and poetry within the harem, and the afterlives of imperial women in the modern era. And so we return again to the interior of the palace, not to its grand turning points, but to its smallest, most persistent rhythms, the hours that filled ordinary days across centuries. Imagine the early light spreading slowly over the Bosphorus, pale and silver, touching the outer walls of Topkapi Palace. Within the harem, the air would still be cool. Servants moved first, always first. Fires were lit in braziers during winter months. In summer, shutters were adjusted to soften the heat. No bell rang loudly to begin the day. Routine itself was the signal. After prayer and washing, senior attendants reviewed assignments. Floors swept. Cushions fluffed and rotated. Low tables positioned precisely. Even repetition required oversight. Disorder suggested weakness. Order reflected stability. Young girls in training spent hours copying calligraphy. Ink stains on fingertips were common. The discipline of writing was believed to cultivate inner control. The flowing script of Ottoman Turkish demanded steadiness of hand and patience of mind. Music lessons followed for some. The oud rested across the lap, its curved body polished smooth. Fingers plucked softly. A melody repeated until it became instinctive. Music in the harem was not for performance before crowds. It was for refinement, for internal cultivation. At midday, conversation was subdued. Food arrived in sequence. Bread, rice, stewed vegetables, yogurt, fruit when available. Nothing chaotic. Nothing excessive beyond rank. Even appetite was shaped by custom. In quiet corners, older women often embroidered ceremonial textiles. Gold thread caught the light as it moved through silk. The act was repetitive but meditative. Designs were rarely improvised. Patterns followed established forms passed from generation to generation. The harem was sustained by continuity. And yet, it was never static. In the 16th century, during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached a territorial and cultural height that reinforced palace confidence. Architectural patronage flourished. Within the harem, this meant expanding apartments, commissioning new Iznik tiles, refining decorative arts. When Hürrem's sultan rose to prominence, she reshaped not only court tradition but charitable outreach. Her foundations in Istanbul anchored her influence beyond palace walls. Soup kitchens, baths, religious complexes, these projects tethered her private authority to public memory. Generations later, during the 17th century, political instability increased. Young sultans ascended. Regency became necessary. Figures like Kozum Sultan demonstrated how maternal authority could stabilize governance. Her apartments would have been spaces of negotiation, measured voices, careful listening, decisions shaped slowly. But influence in such a system was never secure. Rival factions formed even within palace walls. Alliances were fragile. A change in Grand Vizier could ripple inward. A rumor could destabilize trust. Still, most days were not dramatic. Most days were structured. Even childbirth, though celebrated, followed strict procedure. Midwives entered. Senior women supervised. Prayers were recited softly. When a prince was born, the atmosphere shifted, relief, calculation, cautious joy. If the child survived infancy, never guaranteed, his education began almost immediately. Tutors rotated through chambers. Lessons in theology, governance, military history. The mother observed closely, shaping temperament with subtle guidance. After the practice of sending princes to provincial governorships ended and confinement in the caves became common, childhood unfolded differently. Windows framed the outside world but did not grant access. Princes learned theory more than experience. Their mothers, increasingly central figures, navigated the delicate task of preparing sons for a throne they might never occupy. This environment cultivated introspection. And sometimes anxiety. Yet the system endured because it provided predictability. Predictability, in a vast empire spanning continents, was invaluable. As centuries progressed and reforms under rulers like Mahmud II sought modernization, elements of Western culture entered palace life. Military uniforms changed outside, bureaucratic systems reorganized. Inside the harem, European fabrics appeared alongside traditional silks. A piano might share space with an oud. Later, under Abdülmecid I, the move toward Dolmabahce Palace symbolized openness to European aesthetics. Larger windows admitted more daylight. Crystal chandeliers refracted it across polished floors. But hierarchy did not dissolve. The Valide Sultan still occupied the highest female rank. Consorts still rose or fell according to favor and motherhood. Princesses still married strategically. The difference was gradual, not abrupt. By the reign of Abdülhamid II, the empire faced mounting external pressures. Surveillance intensified. Communication technology accelerated. Telegraph wires connected provinces to the capital in ways unimaginable centuries earlier. And yet, within the harem, evening still settled softly. Oil lamps replaced by newer lighting technologies perhaps, but the effect remained gentle. Shadows flickered along tiled walls. Conversations lowered as night deepened. Some women read poetry. Others prayed. Some simply sat in quiet reflection. Waiting persisted as the defining experience. Waiting for letters. Waiting for news from distant fronts. Waiting for appointments or dismissals. Waiting for the subtle shifts that mark survival. Then came the collapse after World War I. The abolition of the Sultanate. Exile. Rooms emptied not gradually but swiftly. The centuries-long routine stopped. The silence that followed was no longer disciplined. It was final. Today, as visitors walk those preserved corridors in Istanbul, the air carries a different weight. It is historical, not anticipatory. No one waits for rank now. No one measures footsteps against hierarchy. But the architecture still whispers structure. The sequence of rooms. The narrowing passages. The layered gates. They reveal a system that balanced visibility and concealment with extraordinary precision. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was not simply a secluded domestic space. It was an engine of dynastic continuity. A school of etiquette and endurance. A place where maternal authority sometimes steered imperial policy. A quiet architecture of power. And as we continue this long, unbroken journey through its history, we find that what endures most clearly is not spectacle, but rhythm. The rhythm of prayer at dawn. The rhythm of embroidery thread passing through silk. The rhythm of footsteps across tiled floors. The rhythm of generations rising, ruling, and fading. History, when viewed slowly, often resembles that rhythm more than any dramatic turning point. And as we continue, we slow even further, into a single afternoon, somewhere in the middle of the 17th century, when the empire is neither at its height nor at its collapse, but simply enduring. The sun stands high over Istanbul. Heat settles across the courtyards of Topkapi Palace, pressing gently against stone and tile. Inside the harem apartments, shutters filter the brightness into narrow bands of gold. The day is not remarkable. And that is precisely why it matters. A senior attendant walks slowly across a corridor lined with Iznik tiles. She carries a folded piece of fabric, deep blue silk embroidered with silver thread. It is destined for a younger woman who has recently risen in favor. The gift is not spontaneous. It has been approved. Recorded. Assigned. Nothing in this world moves without acknowledgement. In a nearby chamber, a tutor recites lines of poetry to two adolescent girls seated cross-legged on cushions. They repeat the verses quietly, practicing pronunciation. Their voices are steady. They have learned not to speak too loudly within these walls. Beyond another carved wooden screen, a mother watches her young son trace letters onto paper. His hand trembles slightly. He is perhaps 6 years old. Already, expectation surrounds him like a second garment. She does not overwhelm him with instruction. She does not speak of rivalry. But she understands something he cannot yet comprehend, that his future is not entirely his own. Centuries earlier, during the ascendancy of Suleiman the Magnificent, such a boy might eventually have been sent to govern a distant province, accompanied by his mother, forming a small echo of the imperial court in Anatolia. By the 17th century, practices are shifting. Confinement within palace walls becomes more common. The cafes waits as both protection and limitation. The mother remembers stories told by older women, stories of Hurrem Sultan, who altered tradition through marriage and maternal strategy. Stories of rising and falling fortunes. Stories of regencies shaped by steady hands like those of Kozum Sultan. These stories circulate not as gossip, but as instruction. In another courtyard, two women sit beside a fountain. One embroiders. The other grinds pigments for decorative work. Their conversation is light, the quality of silk from Bursa, the arrival of a new consignment of spices, a minor change in kitchen routine. Yet beneath the surface, they evaluate subtle shifts. Who has been granted additional attendance? Who has received fewer visits? Which eunuch now carries messages more frequently? Information inside the harem travels softly but efficiently. Late afternoon brings cooler air. Shadows lengthen across stone. A quiet signal passes through the apartments, the Sultan will spend the evening within the inner palace. Preparation unfolds without visible haste. Bathwater is heated. Perfumed oils arranged. Garments selected carefully according to rank and protocol. Contrary to dramatic imagination, there is no frantic competition. Access is determined. Order is maintained. Even anticipation must remain composed. If a woman is summoned, she moves through corridors guided by eunuchs who speak little. Doors open and close in sequence. Privacy is layered deliberately. What occurs beyond the final threshold becomes part of palace memory, rarely written, often inferred. If a child results, the consequences extend far beyond the chamber. Back in the larger world beyond the palace walls, events unfold, military campaigns, trade negotiations, provincial disputes. Couriers arrive at the outer gates with sealed documents. The Imperial Council meets. Decisions are drafted. And inside the harem, mothers listen for echoes of those decisions, because they will shape futures quietly but decisively. The evening meal is subdued. Later, lamps flicker. Some women gather for soft music. The oud resonates gently in the enclosed space. Notes linger against tiled walls. The sound does not carry far. In private rooms, older attendants speak to younger ones about endurance. About timing. About restraint. Power here is rarely seized openly. It is accumulated. A favor granted today may be repaid years later. A careful silence may prevent suspicion. A well-placed charitable endowment may secure public goodwill. When later centuries bring reform, under rulers like Mahmud II, the palace will adjust. Military uniforms will change. Bureaucratic systems will modernize. But inside the harem, the essential lessons remain consistent: discipline, awareness, patience. Under Abdulmajid I, as the court transitions to Dolmabahce Palace, architecture will shift dramatically. Grand European-inspired halls will replace some intimate courtyards. Crystal chandeliers will scatter light differently than oil lamps once did. Yet hierarchy will persist. Even in the later reign of Abdul Hamid II, when political tension tightens across the empire, the inner apartments maintain their measured rhythm. Surveillance may expand. Communication may accelerate. But daily life still unfolds hour by hour, thread by thread. And then, in the early 20th century, the rhythm ceases. Exile disperses the dynasty. Rooms empty. The structured waiting ends not with ceremony, but with departure. Today, as visitors step into those preserved chambers in Istanbul, they encounter stillness. But if one lingers, if one imagines a single ordinary afternoon centuries ago, one can almost sense the continuity that once defined this place. Not chaos. Not fantasy. But repetition. Education at dawn. Embroidery at midday. Music at dusk. Whispers after dark. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was built upon such cycles. And empires, like households, are sustained by cycles far more often than by spectacle. So we continue, deeper into individual lives, into the lesser-known consorts whose names appear only briefly in archival ledgers, into the economics that funded the inner court, into the emotional landscape of waiting mothers and sheltered princes. Slowly. Patiently. As history itself once moved within those walls. And so we move even closer now, not to the famous names already preserved in chronicles, But to the quieter figures whose lives are recorded only in passing lines of account books and court registers. Imagine a young girl arriving at the palace gate sometime in the late 16th century. She does not yet know the geography of Topkapi Palace. She has never seen the skyline of Istanbul rising beyond its outer walls. The sea air feels unfamiliar. The language spoken around her sounds formal, precise. Her name, as given at birth, may not follow her inside. She is assigned to a training cohort. Her days are structured immediately. She wakes before sunrise. She learns posture before she learns politics. She learns silence before she learns strategy. The older attendants observe her closely, not with cruelty, but with calculation. Does she learn quickly? Does she show patience? Does she react impulsively? Even temperament matters in a world where emotional control can determine survival. Weeks become months. Months become years. The palace shapes her without spectacle. She learns how to walk across tiled floors without echoing her steps. She learns how to address superiors with exact phrasing. She learns how to sit without appearing either too relaxed or too tense. In this environment, discipline becomes second nature. Perhaps she shows talent in music. Her instructor places an oud in her hands. She practices daily, fingers forming calluses. The instrument's soft resonance becomes part of her routine. Music in the harem is rarely for applause. It is for refinement, a cultivated atmosphere of composure. Or perhaps she excels in calligraphy. Her script grows steady, elegant. Letters become balanced, controlled. In a palace where written correspondence can influence appointments and alliances, beautiful handwriting is not trivial. Time passes. Some girls remain in lower ranks for years. Others rise quietly. Promotion rarely comes with public announcement. It appears in subtle changes, better quarters, additional attendants, access to certain corridors. If she attracts notice from the Sultan, her life shifts. But notice does not guarantee security. Only motherhood offers relative stability. And even then, stability is conditional. In earlier centuries, during the reign of figures like Suleiman the Magnificent, the birth of a son might eventually lead to relocation to a provincial capital, where her child would govern as part of his preparation for rule. There, she would oversee a miniature court, exercising real administrative influence. Later, when succession practices evolve and princes remain confined within the palace, her influence concentrates inward instead. The caste system alters everything. Her son grows up within enclosed apartments. His education is thorough, but his exposure to governance is limited. She becomes not only mother but interpreter of the outside world. In this confined environment, maternal guidance gains new weight. Stories circulate quietly through generations, stories of Hurrem Sultan, who redefined her position through marriage and diplomacy. Stories of Kozum Sultan, who navigated regencies during times of uncertainty. But for every woman whose name survived, dozens remain nearly invisible in historical memory. Their lives unfolded in repetition. They supervised lessons. They oversaw kitchen allocations. They monitored servants. They prayed at dawn and dusk. They waited. The economics of the harem quietly sustained them all. Each rank received a stipend recorded meticulously in palace ledgers. Textiles were ordered seasonally. Candles calculated by need. Medical supplies stocked carefully. Physicians visited when necessary, their access controlled and documented. The inner palace was not chaotic indulgence. It was administration layered upon administration. When reforms under Mahmud II reshaped military structures and bureaucratic offices, the palace economy adjusted as well. Imported fabrics appeared more frequently. European goods filtered into elite consumption. Under Abdulmajid I, as the court shifted toward Dolmabahce Palace, the architectural environment changed dramatically. Larger halls, crystal chandeliers, expansive staircases, yet the internal ranking system persisted. Even in the late 19th century, during the tense reign of Abdul-Hamid II, when political caution dominated the empire, daily life inside the harem retained its structured calm. Morning lessons. Midday tasks. Evening reflection. And always, the quiet evaluation of favor. Favor is difficult to measure in historical documents, but it was deeply felt within these walls. A reduction in visits. A reassignment of attendance. A delay in stipend. Small signals carried enormous meaning. Women learned to interpret nuance the way scholars interpret text. Then, in the early 20th century, the continuity fractures. War. Occupation. Abolition. Exile. The unnamed women, those who never held regency or commissioned great foundations, leave as quietly as they once lived. Some fade into distant cities. Some adapt to modest domestic lives far removed from imperial structure. The harem ceases not with ceremony but with dispersion. Today, when visitors step into those preserved apartments at Topkapi Palace, they encounter architecture without its inhabitants. The Iznik tiles gleam. The carved screens filter light. But the measured footsteps are gone. What remains is the pattern. The repetition. The understanding that history is often built not only by dramatic figures but by generations who maintain systems day after day. The Ottoman Imperial Harem endured for centuries because it was disciplined. Because it educated. Because it adapted. Because it transformed uncertainty into routine. And as we continue this long, unbroken telling, we begin to understand that its true power lay not only in influence over sultans, but in the stability it provided to a dynasty that stretched across continents. There are still deeper layers to explore: the psychology of isolation for princes, the friendships that endured decades, the private devotional lives of women whose public identities were limited, the gradual transformation of memory into museum narrative. And so we keep moving. Slowly. Patiently. As if walking once more through corridors where even the smallest sound once carried meaning. And now, as we continue, we move inward again, not through architecture, but through the interior experience of time itself inside the imperial harem. Time in the outer empire was marked by campaigns, treaties, rebellions, coronations. Time inside the harem was marked by smaller transitions. A child's first lesson. A young woman's promotion. The aging of a Valite sultan. The quiet reassignment of rooms. Years passed almost invisibly within the walls of Topkapi Palace. A girl who once copied letters nervously at a low desk might, a decade later, supervise others doing the same. She would notice how her own voice had grown calmer. How her instructions had become measured rather than hesitant. Hierarchy did not merely organize the harem. It aged with it. The older women carried institutional memory. They remembered which alliances had failed. Which temperaments had thrived. Which ambitions had overreached. Their advice was rarely dramatic. It was usually phrased as caution. Wait. Observe. Do not speak too quickly. Because speech inside the palace could ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Consider the mother of a prince during the late 17th century. She wakes before dawn, performs prayer, and then sits quietly while attendants prepare her son's lessons. She understands that his tutors will instruct him in theology, history, and governance. But she also understands that temperament matters as much as knowledge. If he is impatient, she must soften him. If he is timid, she must strengthen him. If he is proud, she must temper him. She cannot publicly rule. But she can shape the ruler. In earlier generations, during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire expanded confidently. A prince's education included the expectation of governing provinces. By the time he returned to the capital, he carried experience. Later, as succession practices shifted and confinement in the caves became more common, princes often reached the throne without ever commanding troops or administering distant cities. In such cases, the formative influence of their mothers, and of the harem's disciplined environment, became even more significant. The palace compensated for inexperience with structure. The Valide Sultan's authority could steady a new reign. Figures such as Kozum's Sultan demonstrated how maternal regency could maintain continuity during turbulent transitions. But even regency required restraint. Too visible a hand could provoke resentment. Too subtle a presence could lose control. Balance defined survival. Meanwhile, daily life continued its quiet repetition. Seasonal rhythms shaped the year. Winter required heavier textiles, braziers lit earlier in the evening. Summer opened inner courtyards for longer gatherings. The sound of fountains became more prominent in warm months, their steady flow cooling the air. Religious observances structured time more profoundly than political events. Ramadan altered meal schedules. Nights became livelier after sunset prayers. The breaking of the fast was communal, yet still governed by rank. Even celebration was measured. Music never overwhelmed conversation. Laughter rarely echoed far. Discipline did not disappear during joy. As the 18th century unfolded, European influence entered gradually. Imported fabrics, clocks that chimed on the hour, diplomatic gifts arranged carefully in reception rooms. But the deeper culture of the harem, patience, hierarchy, maternal strategy, remained intact. Under reforming sultans like Mahmud II, the empire attempted to modernize rapidly. Military corps were dissolved. Administrative systems reorganized. Outside the palace, uniforms changed, institutions shifted. Inside, adaptation was quieter. New fashions appeared beside traditional garments. Western musical instruments joined established ones. But morning prayers still began the day. Lessons still filled the hours. Mothers still watched their sons with careful calculation. When the court moved to Dalmabah's palace during the reign of Abdulmajid I, the environment transformed visually. Grand staircases replaced some intimate corridors. Larger windows admitted more light. European architectural symmetry altered spatial experience. Yet the harem's internal logic survived relocation. Rooms were still layered by rank. Access was still controlled. The Valide Sultan still presided. By the time of Abdul Hamid II, political tension permeated the empire. Surveillance networks extended outward. Newspapers circulated public discourse. The speed of information accelerated beyond anything earlier generations had known. Inside the harem, however, time retained its measured pace. A young girl still learned to embroider. A mother still guided her son's temperament. An older woman still advised patience. And then, after centuries of repetition, the rhythm ended. War disrupted continuity. The Sultanate was abolished. The dynasty departed from Istanbul, carrying memories rather than authority. Rooms that once defined rank became museum exhibits. Corridors once guarded by eunuchs opened to visitors with tickets in hand. But if one pauses inside those preserved chambers at Topkapi Palace, one can almost sense the layered time embedded in stone. Not loud history. Not battlefield glory. But accumulated routine. The Ottoman Imperial Harem endured because it transformed uncertainty into structure. Because it shaped heirs long before they ruled. Because it balanced visibility and concealment with precision. When exile finally came, it did not arrive with ceremony. There was no orchestral farewell in the courtyards. No final procession through the gates of Topkapi Palace. There were lists. Names written in ink. Instructions delivered quietly. In 1924, when the Ottoman dynasty was expelled following the reforms of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the women of the imperial household faced something unprecedented. For centuries, their lives had unfolded within guarded architecture, layered hierarchy, and carefully regulated proximity to power. Now they were told to leave. Not for another wing. Not for another palace. But for another world. Some traveled to France. Some to Egypt. some to Lebanon, some to India. Former princesses who had once walked polished marble corridors now navigated train stations with luggage that held the remainder of dynastic memory, jewelry wrapped in cloth, handwritten Qurans, family photographs, small heirlooms. For women raised within a system of internal structure, exile demanded a new skill, improvisation. A daughter of a sultan might suddenly need to manage household finances personally. She might learn to negotiate rent, to speak in foreign markets, to calculate currency exchange. The discipline of the harem, its emphasis on restraint, etiquette, and observation, became unexpectedly practical. They understood how to maintain dignity under scrutiny. They understood silence. They understood waiting. In cities like Paris and Beirut, former members of the dynasty built quieter lives. Some married into other exiled aristocratic families. Some taught languages. Some relied on extended networks of kin. But something fundamental had shifted. For centuries, identity inside the imperial harem was relational. Mother of a prince. Daughter of a sultan. Consort of a ruler. Outside the palace, identity had to be reconstructed without architecture to enforce it. Memory became their palace. Stories replaced corridors. Rituals replaced hierarchy. A former princess might still wake before dawn for prayer. She might still arrange her sitting room according to remembered spatial etiquette. She might still instruct her children in careful speech. The empire was gone. The habits remained. Meanwhile, back in Istanbul, the transformation of space began. Topkapi Palace became a museum in 1924, the same year the dynasty departed. The rooms once restricted to insiders were catalogued, labeled, and opened. Visitors walked through the harem section with guided curiosity. Glass cases replaced guarded doors. What had once been politically sensitive became culturally significant. But interpretation reshaped perception. Early narratives often exoticized the harem, presenting it as mysterious, sensual, decadent. Yet archival scholarship in the late 20th century began to reframe the story. Historians examined court registers, financial documents, diplomatic correspondence. They revealed administrative labor, educational rigor, political negotiation. The harem was not simply a site of pleasure. It was an institutional space. A training ground. A political network. Modern historians studying figures like Kozum Sultan or Turhan Hadisi Sultan demonstrate how women exercised regency authority, managed patronage systems, and influenced imperial policy during periods of instability. Their power was rarely theatrical. It was procedural. And procedure leaves quieter traces than spectacle. Today, when visitors stand beneath tiled domes and peer into private chambers, they often search for drama. But the true story lies in repetition. In the rhythm of lessons. In the choreography of deference. In the incremental shaping of princes. Consider a young boy inside the palace in the 18th century. He memorizes verses. He studies calligraphy. He learns the geography of provinces he may one day govern. He is watched, not only by tutors and eunuchs, but by his mother. Her influence is steady rather than loud. A raised eyebrow. A delayed answer. A carefully chosen phrase at supper. Power here is formative, not declarative. And when the empire finally dissolved, it dissolved not only a state but a domestic ecosystem. An entire internal civilization, structured, disciplined, multi-generational, faded into memory. Yet something endured beyond politics. Cultural continuity. Recipes passed down in exile. Embroidery techniques preserved by granddaughters. Family genealogies safeguarded across continents. The harem, once an architectural space within the palace, became an intangible inheritance. Today, Istanbul itself carries layered time. Tourists move between the Hagia Sophia, the Blue Mosque, and the courtyards of Topkapi with cameras and guidebooks. But beneath the public monuments lies the quieter truth of domestic empire, the hidden labor that sustained dynastic continuity for 6 centuries. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was not frozen in decadence. It evolved. It adapted. It absorbed reform. It survived succession crises. It endured relocation. And in exile, it transformed again. Power there was rarely a shout. It was a whisper that lasted generations. And so we end not with collapse, but with transformation. Not with spectacle, but with continuity. Because the story of the harem is not merely about walls. It is about the disciplined shaping of influence, carried first through corridors of marble, and later through memory alone. And even now, when evening settles over Istanbul and the last visitors exit the museum halls, the architecture still holds echoes of measured footsteps. Not hurried. Not dramatic. Just patient. As it always was. And yet, even after transformation, even after exile, even after museum placards replaced guarded thresholds, another layer of the story remains, the layer that lives not in documents or architecture, but in imagination. Because the Ottoman Imperial Harem did not disappear from history. It migrated into myth. In the 19th century, European painters who had never stepped inside Topkapi Palace filled canvases with reclining figures, heavy drapery, exaggerated languor. The Orientalist imagination constructed scenes of idle luxury and sensual intrigue. These images circulated widely, shaping global perceptions. But painted fantasy rarely resembles administrative reality. The true harem was governed by protocol, schedules, and rank. Its silence was structured. Its beauty was disciplined. Its power was procedural. The myth, however, proved persistent. Travel literature embellished. Novels dramatized. Later cinema amplified. In the 20th and 21st centuries, television series such as Matizm Yüzyıl revived fascination with the court of Suleiman the Magnificent. Audiences around the world watched palace intrigue unfold in vivid color, ambition, rivalry, devotion, betrayal. Dramatization brought renewed interest, and with it, renewed debate. How much was embellishment? How much was archival truth? Historians returned again to court records, to letters, to vakif, endowment, documents that recorded charitable foundations established by royal women. These endowments tell a quieter story. They reveal women funding mosques, schools, soup kitchens, fountains. They reveal civic engagement beyond palace walls. They show that influence extended into urban life, shaping neighborhoods, sustaining communities. Walk through older districts of Istanbul and you may pass a mosque complex funded by a Valide sultan centuries ago. The stone remains. The inscription bears her name. The charitable intention continues in memory. In this way, the harem's influence was not sealed behind lattice screens. It flowed outward. Education, too, was part of its legacy. Girls trained within the palace left with literacy, artistic skill, social intelligence. Some married into administrative households and carried palace discipline into provincial governance. The network expanded quietly through kinship and patronage. Even architectural aesthetics absorbed harem sensibilities. Tile work, textiles, spatial arrangement, these were not random embellishments but cultivated tastes refined within the court. And then there is the emotional inheritance. Consider the experience of a woman born in exile in the mid-20th century, granddaughter of a sultan she never met. She grows up hearing stories of corridors she has never walked. She sees photographs of marble fountains and tiled chambers. The palace exists for her as narrative rather than residence. Yet identity persists. She carries a surname once synonymous with sovereignty. She learns etiquette passed down through memory. She understands her ancestry as both burden and pride. In interviews decades later, descendants often speak not of lost luxury, but of lost continuity, the interruption of a rhythm that lasted 600 years. 6 centuries. From the rise of Osman I in the late 13th century to the abolition of the Sultanate in the early 20th, the dynasty adapted through conquest, stagnation, reform, crisis. Inside that span, the harem evolved repeatedly. Early frontier simplicity. Classical imperial expansion. 17th century regencies. 18th century refinement. 19th century modernization. And finally, dissolution. Few institutions in world history sustained such continuity while remaining largely invisible to the public eye. Its endurance depended on structure. Structure depended on hierarchy. Hierarchy depended on education. Education depended on patience. And patience, perhaps more than any other virtue, defined the inner palace. Today, when visitors step into the harem section of Topkapi, they move slowly through chambers layered with Iznik tiles and gilded inscriptions. Tour guides explain titles: Valide Sultan, Hasiki Sultan, Kayden, Iqbal. But what cannot be fully conveyed is the lived tempo. The way morning light filtered through patterned screens. The way footsteps softened against carpets. The way a single decision, to speak, to remain silent, to support one faction over another, could alter imperial succession. Power inside the harem was rarely about spectacle. It was about proximity. Proximity to the ruler. Proximity to the heir. Proximity to information. And proximity requires restraint. The Ottoman Imperial Harem, at its core, was a system designed to manage uncertainty, to shape heirs, stabilize transitions, and absorb political shock. When the empire ended, uncertainty did not. But the structure that once managed it dissolved. And so we are left with echoes. Not scandalous secrets. Not hidden decadence. But the steady hum of an internal civilization that operated behind carved doors for centuries. A civilization of mothers and daughters. Of teachers and students. Of rivalries conducted with measured courtesy. Of ambition tempered by survival instinct. Of beauty framed by discipline. If we listen carefully, the story does not end with exile or museum walls. It continues in scholarship. In restored tilework. In digitized archives. In descendants who recount family memories. In visitors who pause a little longer in a quiet chamber and imagine what it meant to live within such carefully regulated space. The harem was never simply a place. It was a method. A method of shaping power before it appeared in public. A method of cultivating influence through education and patience. A method of sustaining dynasty across generations. And methods, even when institutions fall, can echo long after the walls that housed them grow silent. So we continue, not because the palace still governs, but because its internal logic helps us understand something enduring about power itself. That it is often formed in private. That it matures in routine. That it survives through adaptation. And that history's loudest moments are frequently prepared in its quietest rooms. And if we continue even further, beyond architecture, beyond exile, beyond myth, we arrive at something even more subtle. The psychology of enclosed power. For centuries, the Ottoman Imperial Harem functioned as a controlled emotional environment. It was not chaotic. It could not afford to be. Every relationship existed within a calibrated balance of ambition, loyalty, and restraint. Imagine growing up in a world where every corridor contains both opportunity and risk. Where affection may lead to advancement. Where visibility may invite scrutiny. Where silence can be strategy. A young girl entering the palace might initially experience awe, the scale of Topkapi Palace, the shimmer of tilework, the choreography of attendants moving in practiced rhythm. But very quickly, awe would be replaced by awareness. Who speaks first in a room? Who waits to be addressed? Who sits, and who stands? Hierarchy was not theoretical. It was spatial. Physical. Audible. Over time, such an environment produces a particular kind of intelligence. Emotional calibration. The ability to read a room before crossing it. The ability to measure tone, timing, and implication. For women like Kozum Sultan or Hurrem Sultan, this intelligence became political capital. Their influence did not rely on public speeches or battlefield victories. It relied on sustained proximity and careful relationship management. Hurrem Sultan, once an enslaved girl of uncertain origin, rose to become the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, an unprecedented shift in imperial marital tradition. That transformation alone signals something crucial: the harem was not static. It allowed for extraordinary upward mobility under rare but consequential circumstances. But mobility required discipline. No impulsive gestures. No uncontrolled anger. No reckless words. Because inside a closed hierarchy, reputation travels faster than footsteps. Even leisure was strategic. Music lessons were not merely artistic pursuits, they demonstrated refinement. Poetry was not idle ornament, it displayed literacy and intellectual companionship. Embroidery was not trivial, it signaled patience and cultivated taste. Each accomplishment positioned a woman within a network of perception. And perception, in a courtly environment, shapes fate. And through it all, one constant remained. Structured adaptation. The ability to absorb shock without dissolving identity. Perhaps that is its most enduring lesson. Because power, whether imperial or modern, still forms in private spaces. It still depends on mentorship. On discipline. On emotional intelligence. On restraint in moments when spectacle would be easier. The harem teaches us that history's loudest transformations are often prepared in silence. That influence matures long before it becomes visible. That patience can be a form of strength. And that enclosed spaces, far from being passive, can generate profound political consequence. So when we imagine those corridors now, restored, illuminated, visited by millions, we should not search only for intrigue. We should listen for routine. For lessons repeated daily. For the soft cadence of guidance passed from mother to child. For the long arc of preparation that sustained a dynasty across 6 centuries. The story does not conclude with marble and tile. It extends into how we understand power itself. Not as a sudden eruption. But as a cultivated practice. Carefully taught. Carefully guarded. And patiently sustained. And if we go even deeper still, we begin to see that the harem was not only shaping rulers, it was shaping time itself. Empires think in decades. Dynasties think in generations. But the harem thought in continuity. Continuity meant survival beyond any single sultan. It meant preparing not just one heir, but the idea of inheritance. Music lessons were not merely artistic pursuits, they demonstrated refinement. Poetry was not idle ornament, it displayed literacy and intellectual companionship. Embroidery was not trivial, it signaled patience and cultivated taste. Each accomplishment positioned a woman within a network of perception. And perception, in a courtly environment, shapes fate. And through it all, one constant remained. Structured adaptation. The ability to absorb shock without dissolving identity. Perhaps that is its most enduring lesson. Because power, whether imperial or modern, still forms in private spaces. It still depends on mentorship. On discipline. On emotional intelligence. On restraint in moments when spectacle would be easier. The harem teaches us that history's loudest transformations are often prepared in silence. That influence matures long before it becomes visible. That patience can be a form of strength. And that enclosed spaces, far from being passive, can generate profound political consequence. So when we imagine those corridors now, restored, illuminated, visited by millions, we should not search only for intrigue. We should listen for routine. For lessons repeated daily. For the soft cadence of guidance passed from mother to child. For the long arc of preparation that sustained a dynasty across 6 centuries. The story does not conclude with marble and tile. It extends into how we understand power itself. Not as a sudden eruption, but as a cultivated practice. Carefully taught, carefully guarded, and patiently sustained. And if we go even deeper still, we begin to see that the harem was not only shaping rulers, it was shaping time itself. Empires think in decades. Dynasties think in generations. But the harem thought in continuity. Continuity meant survival beyond any single sultan. It meant preparing not just one heir, but the idea of inheritance. Inside Topkapi Palace, succession was never an abstract theory. It was an ever-present tension. The birth of a son altered the internal balance immediately. The illness of a prince shifted alliances. A rumor could ripple through corridors faster than official announcements. And yet, despite this fragility, the system endured for centuries. Why? Because it embedded adaptability into routine. When succession laws shifted, from fratricide to seniority, the harem adjusted its internal expectations. When princes were no longer sent to govern provinces but instead confined in the caves, maternal influence intensified. Mothers compensated for lack of administrative experience with emotional preparation. The training changed. The purpose did not. Consider the difference between public authority and private formation. A sultan might issue decrees under imperial seals. But before he learned to command armies, he learned how to listen. Before he learned how to negotiate treaties, he learned how to interpret tone. Before he learned how to perform sovereignty, he learned how to observe hierarchy within his own household. That early education often occurred under the watchful eye of a Valide sultan, sometimes a figure as formidable as Turhan Hadisi Sultan, who navigated regency during turbulent years of political instability. Regency is not merely temporary rule. It is crisis management. It is knowing which advisors to trust, which factions to neutralize, which public gestures to perform to calm unrest. And crucially, which battles to avoid. Avoidance is rarely celebrated in chronicles. But avoidance can preserve a dynasty. The harem understood this. Its culture rewarded patience over impulse. Endurance over spectacle. Even conflict inside its walls followed ritualized patterns. Rivalries existed, yes. Competition for influence was real. But outright chaos threatened everyone's survival. So tension was often expressed through protocol, through precedence at ceremonies, through subtle alliances, through strategic philanthropy. A charitable foundation could signal political alignment. A marriage arrangement could redirect loyalty. A carefully timed conversation could reshape a succession outcome. All without public confrontation. This was governance in a minor key. Now imagine the sensory world of that environment. The scent of rosewater lingering in corridors. The muted echo of footsteps over layered carpets. The steady murmur of Quranic recitation from a lesson chamber. The flicker of lamplight against his nicked tiles as evening settled. It was not dramatic most days. It was repetitive. And repetition creates culture. Culture creates expectation. Expectation creates stability. By the time the empire entered the 19th century and reform movements accelerated, the palace interior had already weathered multiple centuries of transformation. Sultans came and went. Borders expanded and contracted. Military systems rose and fell. But the maternal architecture of influence remained remarkably consistent. Even under rulers like Mahmud II, who dismantled the Janissary core and initiated sweeping modernization, the inner domestic sphere continued its patient rhythm. Reform outside did not erase formation inside. And yet, no system is immune to historical rupture. The 20th century brought a different tempo: nationalism, constitutionalism, global war. The logic of hereditary sovereignty gave way to republican governance. When the dynasty departed from Istanbul in 1924, a 600-year experiment in enclosed dynastic continuity ended. But what replaced it was not emptiness. It was reinterpretation. Topkapi became a museum. Scholars reassessed archival records. Descendants recounted family histories. Modern Turkey constructed a national narrative distinct from imperial identity. Yet even in this new narrative, the palace remains, not as seat of power, but as repository of memory. Visitors walk through the harem complex today and see rooms labeled with titles that once determined political proximity: Valide Sultan, Haseki, Kadın, Seytsad. They see space. But what once filled that space was relationship. And relationship cannot be displayed in glass cases. It must be reconstructed through careful study. The more historians examine court registers, endowment deeds, diplomatic correspondence, the clearer it becomes. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was not peripheral to governance. It was integral to succession stability. It was an educational institution. A political buffer. A maternal regency network. A space where private discipline translated into public continuity. Its story complicates simple narratives about power being exclusively male, exclusively public, exclusively martial. Instead, it shows how influence can operate through nurture, proximity, and emotional literacy. And perhaps that is why the fascination endures. Because behind every visible structure of authority lies an invisible system of preparation. Behind every ruler stands a network of formative voices. Behind every decree lies a childhood shaped somewhere, by someone, in rooms the public rarely sees. The harem reminds us that power is cultivated long before it is displayed. That stability is often engineered in domestic spaces. That endurance depends not only on conquest, but on careful upbringing. So as night falls over Istanbul, and the museum doors close once more, the tiled corridors return to stillness. No attendants move through them now. No princes recite lessons. No Valide Sultan reviews petitions. But the architecture remains as quiet testimony to a centuries-long experiment in managing uncertainty through structure. And if we listen closely, beyond the myth, beyond the spectacle, we hear something steady. Not the clash of armies. Not the roar of coronations.